You're looking at the cover of a book called Network Nation. Its author, Richard John of Columbia Journalism School graduate program, is here with us to talk about it. You know, I was thinking that when I looked at your topic area here that we've just had an Obama administration policy development on broadband. So there's government support for fully wiring the nation for broadband. You tell the story of government support for two earlier communications technologies.
That's right. We sometimes tell the history of telegraph and telephone by focusing on technology and economics. And that's really not what happened. That in fact, the telegraph and telephone both developed in a political economy in which government regulation was really essential to the way the business strategies of the key players evolved. And that was a surprise to me when I started doing this research, because I hadn't expected to discover just how close the ties were and how different the business strategies were, depending upon the regulatory environment. Regulation really mattered in American history.
So government chose winners and losers in the technology and decided that things would be universal and supported.
Here's what happened. In the case of the telegraph, the first model was that the government would actually own the telegraph network and develop it like the post office. And that was the vision that Samuel Morse had, who held the key telegraph patents. Here he had a patent to an invention that was widely regarded as one of the most fundamental inventions of the age, and the first thing he wanted to do with it was to sell it to the government, because he thought it was much too important to be developed as a private enterprise. He was fearful of corruption from business groups speculating. He was fearful of corruption from the government if the government controlled it exclusively. So he wanted a mixed system with the government regulating. And that's not what happened. In fact, Congress showed very little interest in the telegraph, and the telegraph was commercialized by corporations under state charters in which the corporations developed a business mandate in response to a regulatory environment in which competition was favored. And what was interesting about this was that if you have a regulatory environment that's competitive, the telegraph companies had a very narrow mandate. So in fact, they did not aspire to provide universal service. For example, as late as 1880, the 1880s, the President of Western Union told anyone who would listen that even if the cost of sending a telegram was as low as the cost of sending a letter, the vast majority of Americans would prefer to send letters. So they made no effort to reach into that market, because they feared that if they did, then they would be regulated in adverse ways. In the case of the telephone, the story was very, very different. The telephone emerged in a political economy in which regulation was taken for granted, because you had to hold a municipal franchise. And if you need a municipal franchise, then you cannot have open entry. There can only be a certain number of entrants, because only a certain number of wires can be strung or a certain number of holes can be dug in the ground. As a consequence, it was always politically contested who would get those telephone franchises. And the telegraph companies, after about 20 years of experimentation, decided that the best way that they could basically beat off their political challengers, the city aldermen, was to expand their mandate. So in 1887, you have the head of the Trade Association of Telephone Operating Companies, a Chicagoan, the name of Charles Fay, telling the public that there will never be a time when more than 1/2% of the American people will ever make a telephone call. That was a prediction of manager of the operating company. By 1900...
Catastrophically wrong.
Yes, catastrophically wrong, but you'd think that they'd be the ones promoting, but they weren't. By 1900, telephone companies have completely changed their tune, in part because they make investment, in part because they're fearful of basically extortion by city aldermen. That they make a huge commitment to expanding their services. And it's the political environment that makes that possible. How do we know that? In Canada, you don't have municipal regulation. You don't have expansion of the networks. And you certainly don't have expansion of the networks in Britain or France. So the United States is very distinctive there. And that's where this mandate to what we today call universal service, telecommunications, comes from. It was a mandate only in the cities or only in localities. It was never a mandate to provide low-cost telephone service throughout the country. You and I remember the time when it was expensive to make a long-distance telephone call. And that was not part of the mandate of telephone companies, but the mandate was to provide low-cost telephone service and then to combine that with low-cost telegraph service. And in fact, for a period of 4 years, the leading telephone provider, which then was American Telephone and Telegraph, bought Western Union, the leading telegraph provider, and they tried to provide what the president of AT&T, Theodore Vail, called universal service, and that was low-cost local telephone, low-cost long-distance telegraph. The courts wouldn't permit it. We broke up telegraph and telephone, but that was the vision.
And in fact, AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph.
Right. And when they got their original charter for American Telephone and Telegraph in 1885, they named it intentionally to take advantage of a telegraph law passed in New York State in the 1840s, and that law created very advantageous opportunities for expansion.
Yeah, I see so many parallels to things that are happening in modern communications policy with municipal franchises for telephone,
exactly.
for cable companies, and also with the bundling of services.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, both very interesting. I didn't realize the extent to which the telephone business was shaped by municipal politics, and it's also probably true for early radio. Rates were set. Whether or not you could string wires overhead was set, just as the cable companies were. And that was absolutely essential to business strategy. Now, bundling and unbundling, this was a real surprise to me, because historians have made analogies about early telephone based on internet. And the assumption was, well, we had United States expanded internet access because we had one fee for a year. In other words, you had unlimited service for a certain set fee, for a flat rate, as it were. In the case of telephone, it turns out that this telephone service was popularized in a very different way. That the uniform flat rate was a discouragement to expanding access because it was quite high. New York City could be as high as $175. The way the telephone was popularized in the big cities, which were the leading edge of technology, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, about a dozen other big cities, was they unbundled the services. You'd pay per call, or you'd have a measured service plan where you could have a certain number of calls and then for free, and then you had to pay. In other words, there was a variety of calling plans, and that's what popularized the telephone. In fact, in the city of Chicago and a couple other cities, a very high percentage of telephones, as many as 1/2 of the telephones around 1910, were pay-as-you-go telephones in people's homes. So you'd actually put a nickel in the slot to make a local telephone in the city.
Who collected the nickels?
But they had a service person from the Chicago Telephone Company come out every month. It was very labor intensive, but the costs were so much lower. It's now just $1.50 a month, just a nickel a day. Yeah, oh, that's right, works out. And that was a complete revolution in the way the telephone. In fact, the first telephone call you'd make in big cities was in a drugstore, because you'd put your nickel in public telephone, which is now disappearing. This is the moment when they were just emerging. So you'd go to a drugstore. It was a loss leader for the drugstore owner, because you get foot traffic, people coming in, you'd put the nickel in, and for a time you didn't even have to put a nickel in. You just called without charge. And that's how the telephone company got the idea that they could install a similar apparatus. It didn't have to be quite as sturdy, but a similar apparatus in boarding houses and private homes, where you'd pay as you go. You'd just pay for what you got. There was no service charge, no installation charge, no equipment charge, and that was how the telephone was popularized in very big cities.
Now, are you interested in the telegraph as a sort of a capsule view of a period of American history? The telephone obviously is still with us and seems like it will always be with us in some capacity. Why are you interested in the telegraph?
Well, the telegraph was the first electrical communications medium, and we often make assumptions about the present day on the basis of the telegraph. A popular book a couple of years ago called The Telegraph, the Victorian Internet, something I think very misleading. But it was the first application of electricity to communications, and the telegraph was enormously important in market information, in commerce, and very important in news. We still call them the wire services. And a very high percentage of American news went through a Western Union, which was the major telegraph provider, by a close arrangement with a trade association known as the New York Associated Press, which is different from the present-day Associated Press, although they have the same name. And they had a kind of collusive arrangement